Is our world moving faster and faster, or is it just me? My guest today says the speed at which we are living may have something to do with our frantic efforts to outrun our own unhappiness and discontent. Ouch. You are going to love this discussion. Dr. Lane Cohee, welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl. Appreciate it for the opportunity.
Yeah, now you say that we're running with this restless discontent. What is that?
Well, I think we are running faster and faster all the time. And as one author has put it, many times we are running from our own unhappiness. That is, the things that emerge from our disquieted soul keep us occupied so that we really don't have to pay attention a lot of times to the things that ultimately matter most. And I think that is a characteristic that we're learning externally from our society, and perhaps a lack of spiritual training sometimes that we need to engage more in.
You know, you wrote about this in your book, The Disquieted Soul, and I enjoyed it very much. Tell me what a quieted soul looks like. It's the opposite of what we're living. What would it look like if we were able to quiet that restless discontent?
So, like you, we live in a lot of water, near a lot of water in Florida. Maybe a little warmer,
yeah,
but,
just a little bit.
But a lot of water. And a lot of times I drive over what we call the intercoastal waterway, and it's calm and it's placid, but it is forceful, it's directional, it moves with purpose and engagement. And I think we can do that and should. We should be about our calling, what God has called us to do. We should be about purpose. But we can do that without buying into the entire frenetic, anxious, discontented, restless, oftentimes just, tumult of life. I think those things God can teach us increasingly to quiet and to isolate ourselves from.
You know, you say that we equate being busy with being important, and that was a
Yes.
big ouch because you ask anyone how they're doing or whatever, and they're like, too busy.
I'm so busy.
Right? I might have said that a time or two. So tell me how we've equated that, how we break that mentality.
I think the question ultimately is, where do we find value? And a huge thing from my experience and just talking with people is, how are we validated? Where do we find our sense of significance? Significance is something that God has given us. It's God-given. It's, in the garden, giving us purpose, giving us meaning. But the question is, how do we get those needs met? And I think in our society, our culture, we have taught ourselves to believe that busy equals more important. If we can just explain how busy we are and how many things we're doing or whatever it is, that people are going to attach value to that. It's the currency of value that we use, but I don't necessarily believe that it's the currency of God's value.
As that's hard sometimes to really look into our own souls to say, what's really happening within me? I mean, we'd rather do anything else, like clean the toilet than actually deal with our own emotional mess.
Right. It is, as one friend said, we keep ourselves busy so that we don't have to worry about or think about the important things in life, or the meaning of life, I think is how he put it.
Now, you talk a lot in the book about shame and pride and how that relates to the human paradox. Can you explain that to me?
I do. I think it's interesting. I believe that disquiet is rooted ultimately in shame and pride. And what do I mean by that? Shame and pride seem to be very different bedfellows. Pride, pounds its chest and is always showing off, and shame, you kind of sometimes think about hiding in the shadows. But both of them come from a very defective sense of self, and both of them are rooted in the fall. I mean, they go back to the Genesis 3. Shame is the very first manifestation of the fall that we see when Adam and Eve were naked and hid themselves because they were ashamed of what they had done. How does that come into play with disquiet? I think it comes into play because shame and pride ultimately are self-protective. I have postulated in The Disquieted Soul that the majority of the reason why it is that we're always running and always trying to control our circumstances and sometimes use addictive tendencies to manage our lives is because we're afraid of pain. We're protecting ourselves from things. Potential things that might be happening, circumstances that may be going on in our lives that may be scary to us, relationships that hurt, rejection, devaluation, unrequited love, or pain of physical pain, health, and so forth. And we try to protect ourselves from those things because ultimately we're living from a basis of self-protection and shame and pride.
So now how do we start overcoming those things?
So I think, first of all, and what we try to do, at least in the first section of the book, is to try to diagnose that and understand what that what that really means. But as we begin to unpack it, I've suggested that there are three things we really need to understand. First of all, our identity in Christ, our true identity in Christ, dealing with shame and pride at a very real level.
So that's basically who God says that we are.
That's who God says that we are, not necessarily who the world says we are or even who we say we are a lot of times. Who does God say that we are, objectively? And the second thing is, our sense of who God truly is, what I call the God of the circumstances. Who is God? What is God's identity in a sense? And the third is recovering a heart of trust. And a lot of times when we talk about disquiet or anxiety or whatever, we immediately say, well, we need to trust God more. Well, that's easy to say.
Sounds kind of pat, doesn't it?
Yeah, but there's really a bit of work that needs to be done, I believe, before we can get to the point of really understanding what true trust means.
So how do we do that? How do we, especially I think, people who've been abused in any way, who've been betrayed in any way, a lot of times trust is way harder. And most of us, if you live long enough, are going to experience that.
Right. So first of all, that's why I think starting with who God says we are from an identity perspective is so critical. Because the voices that we many times will hear are voices of shame and pride. They're voices from the enemy, they're voices from ourselves, they're voices from an environment that are, not necessarily telling us the truth. We may be buying into things like you're not good enough, or whatever you do doesn't matter, or nobody really loves you, or you're an ugly person. And that may come from our background. It may also just come from the way we are, our DNA, if you will, when we come into the world. The question is, how do we really change that sense of self? That's the first thing. The second is, how can we really begin to reframe our idea of God in the circumstances? We've all looked at God's in the rearview mirror and said, boy, I'm glad God was in charge and I wasn't, right? We have those experiences, but we forget them very quickly. Just like the Israelites forgot the deliverance from Egypt within, a matter of a very short period of time. They're making idols for themselves.
And started complaining and,
Right.
oh, we've been abandoned.
Right. It's very hard to remember God in the midst of difficult circumstances. But to your ultimate question, trust, I have said that we really have to be willing to engage in pain, which is not necessarily the first place that we ever want to go.
Exactly opposite to your instincts.
Exactly the opposite to our instincts. How would we do that? We're not masochistic, and I'm not trying to sell some formula that doesn't work, but think about, first of all, Jesus told us, in this world we will have trouble. It's guaranteed. So we should expect there is going to be trouble, but be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. So the first thing is he's been honest about the fact that there is going to be pain, there is going to be trouble, there are going to be sorrowful, there are going to be wounds, and there is going to be hurt. But the second thing is there's purpose in the pain. I just lost a sister-in-law yesterday to cancer.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
60 years old, and she probably, I know she loved God much, much more than I did. I think about those circumstances, and there's no promise that those kinds of painful things for her husband and for her children and so on and so forth are not going to happen. And yet, in God's design, he shows purpose. If it's anything but making us more compassionate people, or people who I can identify in the journey of life struggles, or being prepared in a situation for a day such as this. Who knows what it is, but there's purpose in it. It's not just random, chaotic, capricious, arbitrary, mean stuff that God does to us. Joseph probably didn't know the purpose of the pain, as he was going through it, getting prepared to be able to deliver his people.
Yeah, he was in prison for so many years.
And the last part of it is, we serve a God who wears our wounds, and no other God does that. As Os Guinness says, no other God wears wounds. Not only has he gone before us in a life of pain, so he identifies with our pain, but he goes with us. He communes with us through those difficult and painful circumstances. And the paradox of pain is that when we are willing to trust God, getting to a point where we can actually go into it, we can experience, if yet imperfectly, some sense of peace beyond understanding.
Which is what the Bible promises us, right?
Which is what
if
the
we
Bible
turn to God.
promises, right? That there will be a peace that transcends our understanding. And where does that come from? It's unexplainable, right?
Really
And that's the
is.
paradox.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming to share just a little bit of this book. It went by way too fast. I
Thank
think
you.
you're going to have to get your copy of The Disquieted Soul, Lane Cohee. Amazing book and deep, deep thoughts that, you know what, in this culture, we need, these are the kinds of things that we need to think about, because running around like a chicken with our head cut off, and not just being busy on the outside, but being busy on the inside.
Right.
That's where it all begins.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate it.
So if you need a little bit of quiet to your soul today, maybe you need a little help trusting God that whatever you're going through, that there will be a day of peace for you, that his peace could even come today in the middle of your pain, in the middle of your loss, as Lane shared, that you could actually have that today. I know it's possible. I've experienced it. And I want to say to you, I want to challenge you today. Ask God for it. Say to him, God, if you are real, even if you don't know for sure that he is, if you are real, I ask you to make yourself real in the middle of my circumstance right now. And if you need someone to pray that with you, there are the most kind, loving people you could ever meet on the other end of our phone lines, 24 hours a day. Give us a call, 1-866-273-4444. We would love to pray with you. We'll be right back.